Hello, and welcome again to the J-Axis on YouTube. Your host, Jason Lewis, here for episode 4. We're going to be talking about the multiverse. The multiverse is something that I've been fascinated with for a long time, and it's one of those things, when people ask me about it, what makes you think the multiverse exists, I always counter them with, well, do all possibilities exist? And most people say, well, yes, of course all possibilities exist, and if that's so, then there has to be a realm for that to be able to play out. And the way that I sort of use to back up notions like this with geometry come from a lot of different ideas of playing upon different perspectives. Meaning, if you're looking at a shape, and I use sacred geometry shapes a lot for this because they're great for it, and one of my favorite examples is Metatron's cube. And when you look at that, if you're looking at it in a two-dimensional way, it's a hexagon, but if you look at it in a three-dimensional way, it's a cube. Now, if you think about this as comparing it to parallel universes which exist within the same multiverse, it's like the perspectives, you know what I mean? The two-dimensional perspective of the hexagon and the three-dimensional perspective of the cube all exist within the same space, but they're separate perspectives, just like separate parallel dimensions could be within an overlapped multiverse existence. And that sort of plays upon the principles of higher dimensions that I talk about, which are perspective, illusion, and overlap. And the way that sort of works out is, imagine like you're looking at a point, and it could be a line, but you're only originally seeing a point because of your perspective. So you could reveal an overlap of your perspective and see that the original perspective of the point was actually an illusion, and it was a higher dimensional line, and it was hidden through overlap. Continue that with the second dimensional overlap into a square, then a square into a cube. And if you see this pattern sort of playing out sequentially throughout dimensions of perspective, overlap, and illusion, then there's no reason that shouldn't continue into the fourth dimension. And with the fourth dimension, one of the things that we attribute it to is space and time. So let's think of space and time as if they're coexisting the way that we say that the fabric of space-time, and the same way that we see height and depth coexist within the third dimension. And if you could have an overlap of spaces, two different spaces which are overlapped by time, then that's like two different parallel dimensions or two different parallel universes where they exist at the same time, but they're two different spaces of two different possibilities that are playing out within that time. Or you could look at it with separate times which are existing within the same space, and that would be like time travel, lack of a better word. Two different times that exist within the same universal space. And that sort of plays into how the multiverse could exist when you're imagining fourth-dimensional overlaps in that way. It gives it a geometrical way of existing and a structural way of existing as well. And that sort of plays into one of my other theories, which I call relative adjacent realities, which could exist within the multiverse. And that sort of uses the ideas we have within geometry and math about how close each different parallel dimension would be relatively to each other. And I think that works out based on the differences in each reality and how large or small they may be. Meaning, a parallel universe that's completely adjacent directly to ours, the only difference might be that one person in this entire reality ate a Pop-Tart instead of cereal for breakfast this morning. And the larger that the differences get, the further that they are relatively to each other within the multiverse, and how the multiverse overlap as parallel dimensions. And I believe that it's constants and variables that hold that sort of together. And the way that you can imagine that is there's certain things that should always have to play out, but they don't necessarily always have to play out the same way. And the example that I always love to use with this is eventually, on Earth, someone was going to discover electricity and how to harness electricity. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be Benjamin Franklin. In a different reality within the multiverse, someone else very well could have discovered electricity. Electricity and the discovery is the constant, but the discoverer is the variable. And when we're imagining the multiverse, how like physical matter and, ourselves and everything that is physical matter could exist within more places at once, because that's what that suggests with the parallel dimensions. And when you look at electrons within atoms, the electrons that make up atoms, that make up matter, not only can exist in more than one place at a time, but they must exist. So if the very elements which make us up are able to exist in such a manner, then it sort of makes sense and gives it a quantum possibility of how all of that could work. The parallel versions of ourselves and parallel versions of everything which exists in the multiverse. It's all based upon perspective. When you think about it, when, however small a difference might be in an adjacent reality, that difference is a change in perspective. Perspective is really what splits the differences in parallel dimensions, which are parallel universes that exist within the multiverse. Perspective is one of those higher dimensional, principles that I put forth. So it's very important in the higher dimensions, and I believe in how we'll be able to accomplish things like time travel and interdimensional travel and teleportation and stuff like that. Speaking of which, that's what I want to talk about in the next episode. As this episode closes, we'll be discussing time travel and sort of my philosophies behind that. If you haven't checked me out on Instagram yet, check it out, the J-Axis page. You see a lot of the art that I'm sharing here and see a lot of the ideas sort of more fleshed out sporadically. And we'll see you next time. Have a good day.